He died owning more of the earth than any human being in all of recorded history, and he started from nothing. Not a small kingdom with modest walls and a handful of loyal men. Nothing. A felt tent, a broken family, and a plain so wide it had no visible edge. The man who would one day receive letters from kings begging him not to destroy their cities was once a 9-year-old boy standing on the Mongolian steppe watching his father's body cool in the grass. He had no army, no allies, and no plan. He had a name that meant iron, and a mother who was trying not to cry. And here is the question that historians have sat with for 800 years. At the very lowest point of his life, when he had been enslaved and abandoned and left with nothing, when the last person who might have helped him had turned and ridden away, what single human decision did he make in that moment that started everything? Not a military decision, a quiet one, a personal one, so specific and so surprising that when you hear it, you'll understand everything that came after. That is where tonight takes us. Before we begin, a small and genuine word. This channel exists because of the people who listen to it. If these stories bring you peace at the end of your day, if they give you something to carry into sleep, the only thing I'll ever ask is this. Hit like if this story stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you, and share it with one person who deserves a good story tonight. That's it. That's all this needs to keep going. Now, let us go back. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go where it needs to go. Somewhere out there right now, the Mongolian steppe is dark and wide and cold, and the stars above it are the same stars that watched all of this begin 800 years ago in a world so different from yours that it barely seems real. But it was real, every moment of it. And the man at the center of it was before anything else just a boy who wanted his father back. His name when he was born was Temujin. Say it softly, Te-mu-jin. His father gave him that name to honor a Tartar chieftain he had defeated on the very day of the boy's birth, and it carried the feel of iron and the sound of something that would not bend under pressure. He came into the world somewhere along the Onan River in what is now northeastern Mongolia, probably in the year 1162, though historians have argued that date across generations. What nobody argues is what the shamans observed when the infant arrived. His right fist was clenched, tight around a dark clot of dried blood. The shamans said it was a sign. They said this child was marked for something. They were right, though none of them could have imagined the scale of it. His name when he was born was Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man with enough horses to matter, but not quite enough to be feared. The Mongol people were part of the broader Mongol people, one of dozens of tribal groups scattered across the steppe, moving with the seasons, herding horses and cattle and sheep, living in round felt tents called gurs, sleeping close for warmth when the winter came down from the north like a long, patient blade. The steppe remembers everything. Life on the Mongolian plain wasn't soft. Winters dropped to temperatures that could kill a horse left in the open. Summers were brief and blazing and over before you felt ready for what came next. Water was where you found it. Food was what you hunted or herded or carefully traded for. And when the trading was bad and the hunting was worse, families went hungry. Children died without anyone writing it down. Whole lives disappeared into seasons that gave nothing back. Temujin grew up understanding this from the beginning. He grew up knowing that survival wasn't something that happened to you without effort. It was something you constructed, slowly, with your hands and your patience and the people you could trust enough to stand beside you. The Mongol world had no cities, no written law, no single unifying king. Power moved like weather across that enormous plain, gathering around the men who could hold it and dissolving when they couldn't. Alliances on the steppe were fragile things. The same clans who shared your fire in autumn might raid your horses in spring. Loyalty was real, but it was conditional, tied to strength, to food, to the practical ability of a leader to protect his people and to take from others when necessary. When a strong man died, the world rearranged itself almost immediately. Everyone understood this. Even the children understood it.
The warm smell of horses on cold morning air, the sound of felt walls moving in wind, those were the first things Temujin knew. He had brothers, Hasar, strong and already a fine archer, Hachun, the quieter one, Temuge, the youngest, still small. He had a half-brother named Begter, older by a few years, different-mothered, always slightly separate from the others. And he had a sister, Temulun. They were a family, held together the way most families on the steppe were held together, by the steady presence of a capable father and the will of a mother who had decided quietly and completely that she would not allow them to fall apart. His mother's name was Holun, and she is one of the most important people in all of this story. She had not chosen to marry Yasuge. She had been taken from another man on her wedding journey, captured while her first husband rode away and left her behind rather than fight for her. This was not uncommon on the steppe. In a terrible way, it was just the world. But Holun carried that knowledge her whole life, the specific understanding that the world could reach in and rearrange your future without asking permission, without giving you any warning at all. She raised her sons with that knowledge folded into everything she taught them. Temujin was 9 years old when his father decided the time had come to find him a wife. This, too, was custom. A boy of 9 or 10 would be brought to a neighboring tribe. A girl of similar age would be chosen, and the two families would be bound together going forward. The boy would live with his future wife's family for years, working, proving his worth, becoming part of their world, before eventually taking the girl home. It was practical. It was how alliances lasted across generations, and it was how Temujin came to meet a girl named Borte. Her father's name was Day the Wise, chief of the Ungirat tribe, a people known not for their warriors, but for the quality and steadiness of their daughters. When Yasuge arrived at Day's camp, he saw immediately that this man had something valuable for the Mongol future. Borte was 10 years old, dark-eyed and composed, with a quality that even the oldest accounts describe as a particular kind of quiet steadiness, the sort that doesn't shift when the weather changes. Day the Wise looked at Temujin and saw something too. He told Yasuge directly, "This boy has fire behind his eyes. Leave him here with me. Let me know him properly." And so Yasuge left his oldest son with strangers in a camp far from everything familiar and turned his horse north to ride back to his own people. He never made it. On the way home, Yasuge stopped to share food with a group of Tatar men he met on the road. This was courtesy. This was the expected thing. You didn't pass a camp without accepting what was offered, and you didn't offer anything less than what you had. But the Tatars recognized him. They knew this Borjigin chieftain, this man who had raided and fought against their people, and they quietly put poison in his food. He rode on, not knowing. He made it back toward his own camp, but by then the poison had done what it was meant to do. He was dying, and he knew it, and he sent a rider south to Day the Wise's camp with one instruction: bring Temujin home, bring him back before I go. The boy arrived in time. Yasuge was still breathing. What passed between father and son in those last hours, history doesn't record with any detail. We know only that Temujin knelt beside his father, and then, not long after, his father was gone. He was 9 years old. The fire was low. The steppe goes very quiet in the dark hours before morning. The steppe remembers everything. What happened next tells you almost everything about the world Temujin had been born into. The moment Yasuge died, the Borjigin elders made a decision. A chieftain was gone. His sons were young and couldn't yet lead. Holun was a woman taken from another tribe, not truly Borjigin blood, not truly their obligation. Why should they continue to feed and protect a family that could offer them nothing useful right now? They left. The entire clan packed their horses and their jurs and their animals, and they rode away and left Holun and her children on the open steppe with nothing. Just like that, gone with the dust. The cold that settled on that camp must have been something beyond ordinary cold. 6 children, 1 woman, no horses of any significance, no food reserves worth mentioning, no allies within a reasonable ride. A Mongolian winter was already gathering on the northern horizon, like something patient and very large. Let the quiet of that moment sit with you for just a second. Breathe it in. You're safe where you are, and the story is right here with you. Most families in that situation would have died, quietly, without anyone writing it down, folded back into the grass the way so many others had been before them. History wouldn't have noticed. History was busy with kingdoms and dynasties in China to the south, with caliphates and crusades to the west, with the great stone cities of a world that had no idea the steppe existed except as a distant, vague direction.
Nobody was watching a widowed woman and her small children trying not to starve. But Holun wasn't most people. She fed her children on wild garlic and pine nuts and roots she dug from the riverbank with her hands. She taught them to make fish traps from bent wood and twisted grass. She walked miles along the Onan River, looking for whatever the water could give up. She didn't mourn where her children could see her, and whatever she felt in the dark hours when they were sleeping, she kept it entirely to herself, locked somewhere deep where it couldn't cost her anything she needed for the next day. The faint smell of something small cooking in the dark, firelight making long shadows on felt walls. Temujin grew. His brothers grew. They were hungry often, and the hunger did something to all of them. It didn't break them, it sharpened them. Temujin, in particular, seemed to absorb the difficulty of those years, not as something simply to be endured, but as something to be studied. He watched his mother. He watched how she made decisions without wasting anything, how she never spent words that didn't earn their keep, how she kept fear from making her loud or reckless when loud and reckless would have cost lives. She didn't perform strength, she just had it. He was learning, without knowing he was learning, what it meant to hold people together when the world was giving everyone reasons to let go. There was an incident in those hungry years, small but important. Temujin and his brother Hasar caught a fish one afternoon from the Onan River, which, in a time of near starvation, was something close to a treasure. Their older half-brother begged her, larger and already establishing a habit of taking what he wanted, took it from them. He had taken food before, more than once, but something about this particular afternoon, this particular fish, this depth of hunger, pushed something in Temujin to a place from which he couldn't come back. What happened next is one of those moments historians write carefully around because it's genuinely uncomfortable. Temujin and Hasar went after Begtur, and they killed him. Temujin was perhaps 12 years old. Holun's response to what her sons had done is recorded in the secret history of the Mongols with a directness that still carries weight across the centuries. She was furious, not because she didn't understand the hunger and the anger that had built up over months, but because she understood something the boys didn't yet. In a world where you have no one else, you don't reduce the people you have. Every set of hands is survival. Every person in your circle is warmth and food and the ability to fight back. She told them plainly, "You have no companion but your shadow. You have no whip but your horse's tail. Why have you done this?" But Temujin had already decided something, without words, perhaps without fully knowing it was a decision at all. He had decided he would not be taken from anymore. The steppe remembers everything. He was 13 or 14 when the Taichiut clan, the people who had abandoned his family to the winter after his father died, decided Temujin was starting to matter. A boy who had survived what he'd survived, who had his father's name and his mother's will, who was already being spoken of among scattered Borjigan survivors as someone worth watching. That boy was a problem. A small problem for now, but problems grow. They rode to his camp and they took him. He was put into a wooden kang, a yoke device fitted around his neck and shoulders, heavy enough to make sleep difficult, heavy enough to even sitting down and exercise in discomfort. He was passed between families in the Taichiut camp, sleeping outside in the cold, eating after everyone else had eaten, watched constantly. The kang was designed not just to restrain the body, but to communicate something to everyone who saw it. This person is nothing now. Look at what he's been reduced to. He wore it. He said very little. He watched everything. There was a summer festival, one of those gathering days when the Taichiut camp came alive with noise and food and movement. In the confusion of it, Temujin made his move. He turned the wooden beam of the kang into a weapon and struck his guard and ran into the Onan River, into the cold, dark water he had known his whole life. He sank beneath the surface and let the current move him downstream, holding his breath in the cold, disappearing into the river the way the river had always held things that needed to be hidden. The night filled with voices calling for him, torches moving along the bank. A man named Sorkan Shira had noticed Temujin during his months of captivity, not in any grand or dramatic way, just noticed. This was a man with enough of something, call it decency or instinct or simple human clarity, to see that the boy in the kang wasn't just a useful slave, he was a person. When Temujin crawled out of the river in the dark, shaking with cold, the kang still around his neck, and no way to go far, it was Sorkan Shira who found him first. And here is exactly where the first curiosity loop closes and opens into something larger. Because what Temujin did in that moment wasn't what a frightened boy does, and it wasn't what an angry young man does either. He didn't beg, he didn't bargain, he didn't promise anything, he didn't make his case. He just looked at Sorkan Shira and waited. And Sorkan Shira looked back and saw something he couldn't put a name to, and made a decision that was not required of him, not safe for him, not expected by anyone. He hid Temujin in a cartload of raw wool. He kept him hidden for days while the search went on outside. He fed him quietly, without telling his own children more than they needed to know. He removed the kang. He found Temujin a horse and a bow, and he pointed him south, toward the Onon and let him go. Why? That's a question worth holding for a moment. A man of no particular power or ambition, who owed this enslaved teenager nothing, who risked his own life and his family's safety to help someone who by every visible measure had no future worth investing in. Sorkan Shira couldn't have known what Temujin would become. Nobody could. He just knew what he saw standing in front of him. There is something in that choice that runs through this whole story. The way Temujin made people feel seen. The way he seemed, even in captivity, even in the lowest place he'd ever been, to make people feel that helping him was not charity, but recognition. That they weren't rescuing someone, they were choosing someone. He rode south through the night, back toward the Onon River, back toward whatever remained of his family, whatever could be gathered from the years of scattered survival since his father had died. He was still a teenager. He had no land, no horses worth counting, no men who owed him anything. He had survived, which was real and not small, but survival on the steppe without people around you was only the slowest kind of disappearing. What he did next surprised people. He went back to Day the Wise's camp. He went back to Borte. She was still there. She had waited, which was its own kind of remarkable thing in a world where waiting for someone with no horses and no prospects wasn't a practical decision for anyone to make. Her father looked at this young man who had come back out of nothing, and he did not turn him away. Borte became Temujin's wife. Her family gave him a wedding gift that he understood immediately was worth more than its weight. A coat. A sable coat, black and dense and warm, worth a significant amount to anyone in a position to use it as a trading piece or a gesture. To Temujin, it was a key. There was a man named Togru, the powerful Khan of the Karaite tribe, a Christian Mongol leader with real military strength and a name people knew across the steppe. Togrul had been his father's sworn brother, his Anda, his blood ally in the deepest sense the Mongol world had for such things. The bond between Anda was supposed to outlast the men who made it. It was supposed to carry forward to their children and their children's children. Togru had not come when Yasuge died. He had not come when Hoilun was left in the snow with 6 children and a shrinking fire. The bond had gone quiet, unused, maybe forgotten on his end. But it hadn't been canceled. A bond like that didn't cancel. It just waited. Temujin rode to Togrul's camp with the sable coat and presented it as a gift with both hands. He reminded Togrul, quietly and without accusation, that their fathers had been Anda. He asked for nothing specific. He simply re-established the connection, placed it back where it belonged, and let it sit there between them. Togrul accepted the coat. He accepted the young man. He said, in words the secret history records with unusual directness, "I will gather your scattered people. I will return those who have gone their separate ways back to you." The steppe remembers everything. That was where it began. Not with a battle, not with a strategy drawn on any surface, not with a speech to gathered soldiers. It began with a coat and a visit, and a young man who understood something that took most people decades to learn. That the real work of building anything lasting isn't done with force alone. It's done by making people feel that their investment in you is the wisest thing they've done with their loyalty. He was making alliances now the way a careful person builds a fire, slowly, with attention to what catches and what smothers and what needs more room before it's ready to give any real heat. One friendship at a time. One debt honored so visibly that other people noticed and thought, There is someone worth tying your future to. There was another young man in his world from those early days, a companion his own age, whose name was Jamuka. Say it, Jamuka. They had known each other as boys back before everything had gone wrong, and between them had grown something rare and genuinely complicated. The old sources called them Anda, sworn brothers, which was the highest thing a man could claim in terms of personal loyalty on the steppe. They camped together, they shared food and stories, and the particular ease of people who have decided they're safe with each other. They slept under the same open sky. But Jamuka was brilliant in ways that were visible from a distance, and the steppe wasn't wide enough to hold two men who both understood the mathematics of power as clearly as these two did. That tension was still quiet in these years, still folded beneath the warmth of something that was genuinely a friendship. But it was there, the way ice is there beneath late autumn ground, not visible yet, but present.
And somewhere to the north, out in the dark, cold grasslands beyond the Onan, a tribe called the Merkits was remembering something old. The Merkits had not forgotten how Temujin's mother had come to be Yesuge's wife. Years ago, when Yesuge had taken Hoilun from her first husband on the road, that first husband had been a Merkit man. The Merkits held grudges the way frozen ground holds water, right beneath the surface, patient, waiting for the right crack to open. And now they had heard that Yesuge's son was back, that he had a wife, that he was beginning to gather people around him, that his name was starting to travel. The night of the Merkit raid came without any warning that the camp could act on. 300 horsemen moving fast across the dark plain. Temujin woke to the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the thunder of it coming from the north, and he ran. He made it into the forest on Burkhan Haldun, the mountain his people held as sacred ground, and the Merkits searched the tree line 3 separate times that night and couldn't find him. But they found what he had left behind. They took Borte into the dark, and the camp went still. And Temujin stood in the trees on the sacred mountain in the cold night air, listening to the sound of hooves getting quieter and then gone. And there was nothing around him but the dark and the forest and a silence that had suddenly become the loudest thing he'd ever heard. The steppe remembers everything, and tonight it is remembering this. He stood on that mountain for 3 days. Some sources say he wept. The secret history doesn't record it plainly, but it records what he did on that sacred slope, the prayers he offered to the mountain itself, bowing 9 times toward the sun, pouring out an offering of kumis, the fermented mare's milk his people had made ceremonies around since before anyone could remember. He didn't pray quietly. He prayed aloud, with his belt around his neck, in the gesture of a man who has nothing left to offer except his own life as a weight on the scales. He was asking the mountain to give him back what had been taken. Think about what that moment was. Not the prayer itself, but the shape of the man inside it. He had survived his father's murder. He had survived the abandonment of his entire clan in the middle of a winter that should have killed all of them. He had worn a wooden yoke around his neck and been passed between families like something that belonged to no one. He had escaped into a freezing river with no plan beyond not being caught. And now, after all of that, after the careful work of rebuilding, after the coat and the visit to Togrul and the slow gathering of people who believed in something they couldn't fully name yet, the very thing he had been building toward had been taken again. The dark never stops. It just changes its shape. Most men at that point would have felt something close to despair.
Not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that whispers a specific lie. It whispers that the taking is the pattern, that effort leads to loss, that trying is the same as giving the world something else to remove. Temujin may have heard that whisper on that mountain. He may have sat with it in the cold hours before dawn, when the forest was completely quiet and the plain below was nothing but dark. But he came down. He came down and he sent riders north and west and in every direction a rider could go fast, and he called in every connection he had built. He went to Togrul first, because Togrul was the largest piece on the board he currently had access to, and he told the Kherate Khan plainly what had happened. Togrul, remembering the sable coat and the oath their fathers had made, said he would bring 2 tumans of soldiers, 20,000 men. He said it without hesitation. He said, "You are my son," in the way Mongols meant it, which was not metaphor, but category, a real and binding designation. Then Temujin went to Jamuka. The 2 Onda had been camped together all season, moving through the grasslands in the easy way of people who have decided they trust each other completely. Jamuka listened to what had happened, and his response was immediate. He knew which Merkit clan had Borke. He knew the territory. He laid out a plan with the precision of a man who had spent years thinking about exactly this kind of problem. 3 columns, a coordinated approach, drive straight through the Merkit camp at night before they had time to scatter. Temujin listened and agreed, and they rode. The attack on the Merkit camp at the Kilko River came in the dark. 3 armies converging from separate directions, moving fast through night air that smelled of river water and cold grass, and horses pushed hard for days. The Merkits heard them coming, and it was already too late to do anything useful with that knowledge. The camp dissolved into exactly the kind of panicked darkness that Jamuka had designed the approach to produce. Temujin rode through the chaos calling her name. Just that, her name, over and over, into the shouting and the firelight and the horses colliding in the dark. And she found him, or he found her. The old accounts aren't precise about the geometry of the moment, only that they found each other in the middle of the raid, and she was alive. She was also carrying a child. The child, a boy who would be born some months later and named Jochi, meaning guest, carried with him a question that Temujin never answered publicly for the rest of his life. Whether Jochi was his son, or the son of whoever among the Merkits had claimed Borte in the months of her captivity. Temujin acknowledged Jochi as his firstborn without ceremony or qualification. He never discussed what he knew or didn't know, and he made clear by his silence that the question was closed. But the question never quite closed. It traveled with Jochi his whole life like a shadow attached at the wrong angle, and it would eventually surface in ways that nobody that night, riding through the burning Merkit camp with Borte found and the raid won, could have seen coming. The steppe remembers everything. For now there was only the relief of it, the return, the camp rebuilt, and the family together, and the first real demonstration of something people were beginning to notice about Temujin. He asked, and people came, not because they had to, not entirely because he was strong or threatening or inevitable, but because there was something in the asking itself that made people feel the answer should be yes. He and Jamuka rode on together through that spring and into summer. Their combined camp grew large, several thousand followers moving across the grassland together, and for a while It felt like the kind of thing that could become permanent. Two men of equal intelligence, equal ambition, genuine friendship, building something together without either one having to diminish the other. But the steppe has no room for equals at the top. Not for long. A year and a half into their partnership, by most accounts, the split came. Not from a single fight or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, the way most real breaks come, through accumulation of small differences that one day add up to something neither party can pretend isn't there. The sources give different versions of how it started, but what they agree on is this. One morning, Temujin's group and Jamuka's group set out moving camp, and at the fork in the path, Temujin turned one way and Jamuka turned the other, and that was it. Half the followers chose Temujin, half stayed with Jamuka. What moved so many people to choose the man with fewer resources and less established standing over the one with better military knowledge and a sharper tactical mind? This is one of those questions that historians roll around in their hands and never quite put down. Jamuka was brilliant. He was decisive. He was already known across the steppe as someone who could outthink almost anyone he went up against. But there was something in how he treated people that held a particular quality of calculation, the feeling that your value to him was being measured by some ledger you couldn't see, that your place in his world depended entirely on your usefulness in the current moment. Temujin treated the people around him differently. He remembered names. He remembered favors. He assigned roles based on what people were actually good at, rather than on where they came from or which clan they had been born into. He promoted men from nothing if they were capable. He kept his word in ways that were specific and visible and made the watching world note it down. He created loyalty not by demanding it, but by behaving in ways that made loyalty feel like the only reasonable response. The people who chose him that morning at the fork in the path chose something they could feel, but probably couldn't have explained fully in words. He was chosen as Khan not long after, formally, publicly. His followers gathered and the ceremony was performed, and a man named Kokchu, a shaman of significant presence, announced that heaven itself had designated Temujin the leader of all who lived in felt tents. The announcement was part vision, part politics, and entirely understood by everyone present to be both of those things simultaneously. On the steppe, spiritual authority and practical authority had always been inseparable. And Kokchu had understood before almost anyone else that backing this particular man was not a gamble. The firelight on the faces of the gathered people, the enormous dark sky pressing down on all of it from above. And now here is the second question, the one that historians have never fully agreed on, the one that matters more than it might first seem. In the years that followed, as Temujin's power grew and his enemies began to feel real fear for the first time, he developed a practice that nobody else in the Mongol world was doing, a way of treating the people he defeated that was so different from what had always been done that it confused people the first time they encountered it. Some called it weakness, some called it cunning, and some, the ones who paid close enough attention, called it something else entirely. What did he do with the people he conquered that changed everything? Not what he did to the leaders, anyone could predict that. What he did with the ordinary soldiers, the herdsmen, the women with children, the craftsmen who happened to be inside the walls of the wrong place at the wrong time. That specific choice, made over and over across decades, quietly and consistently, is the thing that explains how a man with no permanent home and no divine right and no inherited kingdom built something that 93 nations today contain pieces of. Hold that question. The answer is coming. Let it sit with you for now like something warm. Let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you are. The story isn't going anywhere without you. It's right here in the dark, patient as the steppe itself. The years after his election as Khan were not a smooth upward line. The Mongol world didn't simply yield to him because he'd been named. The naming was a beginning, not a conclusion. There were rivals who saw his growing influence as a direct threat to theirs, and the threat was real, and they responded to it the way powerful men on the steppe had always responded to threats, with horses and weapons and the blunt logic of overwhelming force. Jamuha was one of those rivals now. The warmth of their Anda bond had cooled into something that held the specific chill of a relationship that has turned without either party fully admitting it. Jamuha was gathering his own alliances, building his own case for why he should be the man the steppe organized itself around. And in 1187, or thereabouts, the two former brothers met at a battle called Dalan Baljut. Temujin lost. He lost badly. His forces were scattered, his camp overrun, and Jamuha did something afterward that the old sources record with a flatness that makes it more disturbing rather than less. He boiled 70 of Temujin's captured officers alive in large cauldrons. He tied the head of another man, a chief, to his horse's tail and dragged it across the camp. He did this not because he was a cruel man by general reputation, but because he was making a specific statement about what this victory meant and what kind of world he intended to build. Temujin disappeared into the northeast with what remained of his people. This is the moment the story could have ended, the moment that, if you had been watching from the outside, with no knowledge of what came next, would have looked like a reasonable conclusion. A young man makes a run at significance, gets hit by someone larger and more established, scatters into the hills, and is eventually absorbed back into the ordinary turning of steppe politics. It happened all the time. It was the most common story the steppe produced. Instead, something happened to Temujin in that retreat that functions less like a defeat and more like a second education. He regrouped at a place near Lake Baljuna in the far northeast with a small band of followers who had refused to leave him. The accounts of who was there vary, but one detail persists across multiple sources. The men who stayed with him at Baljuna were not all Mongols. There were Khitans, Muslims, Chinese men, men from tribes and faiths that in the normal structure of steppe society would have had no business being inside the same circle of loyalty. And there, in the cold and the scarcity of that retreat, Temujin drank muddy water from the lake with them and made an oath. The Baljuna Covenant, historians call it. Not a formal document, not a ceremony with witnesses and legal structure. Just a group of exhausted men sharing the worst version of what was available and deciding by that shared act that they were bound together in a way that the normal categories of tribe and clan couldn't describe. He remembered every one of those men for the rest of his life, by name. The cold water on his hands, the flat gray sky above the lake, going on in every direction without edges. He emerged from Baljuna not with more soldiers, but with something harder to quantify, a kind of clarity. The defeat at Dalan Baljut had stripped away whatever remained of the assumption that his rise would be smooth or inevitable. He understood now, in the way you only understand things after they've cost you something real, that every ally had to be earned, every position maintained, every bond renewed with actions rather than assumptions. The steppe would not hand him anything. He went back to Togrul. The Karaite Khan was aging now, surrounded by ambitious sons and advisors with their own ideas about his succession. Temujin saw this clearly. He made himself useful in ways that were specific and visible. He helped Togrul against his brother's rebellion. He helped again against a different rival. Each time he fought on behalf of the older man, he made a point of delivering the victory in a way that made Togrul feel genuinely powerful rather than rescued. He never let his own effectiveness outshine his patron in the telling of it. This was a kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with battles. And his own people were growing, not just in number, though the numbers were growing, in structure. He was building something that the steppe had never quite seen in this form. He divided his forces into units of 10, then 100, then 1,000, then 10,000, the old decimal system that the steppe armies had used in loose form before, but tightened now into something that could actually be commanded with precision. He appointed leaders based on ability. A man from a low clan who was a brilliant organizer became a general. A man from a high clan who was mediocre stayed in a mediocre position.
This sounds obvious. On the steppe, at that time, it was radical. The steppe remembers everything. He built a law, not all at once, not in one document handed down from somewhere high, but piece by piece, a set of rules that applied to everyone inside his world, regardless of where they'd come from. Don't steal from your own people. Treat women within the community with specific protections. Share the spoils of war according to contribution rather than rank alone. And perhaps most strangely to outside eyes, protect the messengers of your enemies. Don't kill them. Don't torture them. A messenger is carrying someone else's words and deserves to make it home alive. People who had grown up in a world without consistent rules felt the ground becoming solid under their feet. There were hard years still. The campaign against the Tatars came during this period, the tribe that had poisoned his father, and it was brutal by the standards of what the Mongol world already considered brutal. When the Tatar camp fell, Temujin ordered something that shocked even his own generals. Every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel was to be killed. Children who survived that measure would be raised as Mongols. Their women would be distributed as wives. The Tatars, as a distinct people, would simply cease to exist. This was not mercy. He never called it mercy. It was a particular kind of solution to a particular kind of problem. Rival clans left intact became future threats. The Tatars had poisoned his father and had been enemies for 2 generations. He made the decision, and he didn't revisit it. There's something cold and enormous in that, and it doesn't simplify into anything comfortable. He also took 2 Tatar women for himself. One was named Yesuge, one was named Karagan, and he added them to his household without any visible conflict between the act and his awareness of why there were no Tatar men left to object. The texture of the man is genuinely complicated. It always was. The firelight moving, the smell of smoke and cold air, and horses at rest. His relationship with Togrul began to crack around this same period, not from any single dramatic act, but from the thing that always erodes alliances between unequal partners when the junior one starts to become less junior. Sengum, son of Togrul, watched Temujin's growing influence with the specific anxiety of a man who can see his inheritance getting smaller every time the Mongol chief wins another battle. He began working on his father, slowly, persistently, the way water works on stone. This Mongol, Sengum said, is not your son. He is your replacement. Look at how many men follow him now. Look at how they look at him, and then look at you. Togrul was old and loved his son, and listened. There was a plan, a meeting arranged under friendly pretense, an invitation to Temujin that would turn into an ambush.
Someone inside Togrul's camp, a man named Kirultu, sent word to Temujin before the meeting, just in time. He didn't go. Instead, he retreated again east, taking the smaller force, the familiar position of being on the wrong side of the numbers. This is one of those patterns in his life that only makes sense when you understand that he was building something in the retreats as much as in the advances. Every time the world forced him into a smaller space, he came out of that space with some new understanding of how the larger one worked.
But this time, the situation was genuinely dangerous. He was separated from his main forces, caught in bad terrain near a lake called Kalk, with a Karaite army coming for him, and not enough men to hold them off on open ground. He sent out riders, calling in every favor, pulling on every thread of loyalty he had ever established. And men came. They came in ones and twos and small groups from every direction across the steppe. Men who had made the calculation that Temujin's odds were poor and shown up anyway, because that was the kind of calculation you made for someone who had always kept his word. The battle, when it came, was not clean or easy or heroically conclusive. It lasted 2 days. People on both sides died in numbers the sources disagree about. Temujin held, which, given the initial imbalance, was itself a form of winning. Togrul's forces pulled back, and in the aftermath, the Karaite world fell into exactly the kind of internal chaos that a weakened, aging Khan with a paranoid son at his shoulder was always going to produce eventually. Togrul fled. He was killed not by Temujin, but by the Naimans to the west, who didn't recognize him and put an end to him before anyone could tell them who he was. And Temujin absorbed the Karaite people. Not all of them willingly, but he did something in that absorption that carried his fingerprint. He did not destroy them. He did not scatter them or erase them or make them perform visible acts of submission designed to humiliate. He gave Karaite nobles Mongol wives. He gave Mongol nobles Karaite wives. He folded them into the structure he was building by making them part of it, by making the boundary between conquered and conqueror deliberately permeable, so that within a generation you couldn't tell from the outside where the Karaite ended and the Mongol began. This was the beginning of an answer to the second question, but only the beginning. The full shape of it was still ahead. The Naimans were next, a powerful people to the west, more literate than the Mongols, more in contact with the settled world to the south and west, with scribes who kept records in the Uyghur script that had been borrowed from the Silk Road cultures along the trade routes. Their Khan, Taiyang, heard what was happening in the east and held a council. The council was not encouraging. His own generals described Temujin's forces in terms that made Taiyang's wife laugh out loud in contempt. She stood up in that council and said, "If you're all this frightened of them, why not just give the Mongols your kingdom and be done with it?" No one recorded her name in a way that has survived well, but the contempt in her voice carries down 8 centuries intact. Taiyang mobilized anyway, and Jamuka, still out there, still brilliant and still with forces of his own, joined the Naiman alliance. This was the last alignment of the old world. Every major force the steppe still had that wasn't yet under Temujin's organization, gathering for one decisive confrontation. Temujin called his generals together the night before the battle, and one of them, his oldest and most trusted general, an adopted brother named Jelme, offered an intelligence report that the Naiman force was enormous and well-positioned, and that perhaps a delay would be strategic. A senior commander named Altan backed him up, and then the youngest significant general in the room, Temujin's own son Jochi, also spoke in favor of caution. 3 of his best people,
telling him to wait. And here is something that runs through every battle account from this period, a small detail that gets lost in the larger sweep of what happened next. What Temujin said to his generals in that tent is recorded, more or less, in the old sources. He didn't shout. He didn't perform certainty he didn't feel. He said simply that a man does not look to his horse for advice on when to run, that they had come too far to give the enemy the gift of another day to prepare, that fear dressed as strategy was still fear. They rode at dawn. The Battle of the Naiman Plain was the decisive confrontation of his rise, not the last great battle of his life, not the one that built the largest piece of what came after, but the one that cleared the board. When it was over, the Naiman state was gone. Taiyang was dead. Jamuka escaped into the hills with a shrinking group of followers and would not be a serious force again. The remaining pieces of the steppe that had not yet acknowledged Temujin found themselves looking at a landscape in which that choice was becoming increasingly one-directional. Jamuka's story didn't end there, but where it went next and how Temujin responded when it did is one of those moments that strips the easy categorization away from the man completely and leaves you sitting with something genuine and uncomfortable and real. His followers, one by one, began leaving him, not because they were cowards, but because the practical calculation had changed past the point where loyalty could override it. Some came to Temujin and were received. Some disappeared into the steppe, trying to build something different. And then, near the end, a small group of Jamuka's own men seized him while he slept and brought him to Temujin in chains, thinking this was exactly the kind of gift a man in their position needed to offer. Temujin had them killed immediately. Not Jamuka, the men who had betrayed their own leader to save themselves. He had them executed in front of everyone, and the message was specific and deliberate and completely understood. A man who would sell his own oath brother for personal safety was not a man who belonged inside any world Temujin was building. Loyalty was the foundation. The foundation was not negotiable. If you broke it once, the entire structure became suspect. Then he turned to Jamuka. The two former Anda stood facing each other for the first time in years. And what happened between them in that meeting is recorded with a detail that feels almost impossible to have survived so accurately, except that it has the quality of something real rather than something invented for effect.
Jamuka asked to be killed cleanly, without blood. On the steppe, death without blood meant strangulation or breaking, a way of dying that kept the spirit intact, according to the beliefs both men had grown up inside. He said he would rather die than live inside a world Temujin owned, not from hate, or at least not only from hate, but because he understood himself well enough to know he couldn't be something lesser than what he'd been. He told Temujin plainly, "You and I were once the same size. We are not the same size now. And I know what I am when the world makes a man smaller than his nature requires." He asked for it, and Temujin gave it to him. Whether he wept afterward is not recorded, whether anything on his face in that moment carried what the two of them had been to each other at the beginning, before the fork in the road, before every choice that had made the fork necessary. Nobody wrote it down if they saw it. But somewhere inside the man who had just given his oldest friend a dignified death, there must have been a room that had been open for most of his life and was now permanently closed. Some doors don't stay open just because you want them to. The year 1196, 1197, The precise dating shifts depending on which historian you trust, and the cold spring wind coming off the Henty Mountains, and the steppe going on in every direction without end, and somewhere in that enormous openness, a single man on a horse, looking at the horizon with the very specific feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere he spent 20 years trying to reach, and isn't sure yet what to do with the silence that arrives when everything you fought for finally has no more fight left in it. That specific quiet, not peace exactly, something more complicated than peace, the kind of stillness that comes after enormous effort when the body is still running on the memory of urgency and the world outside has stopped providing reasons to move fast. He had been in motion toward something for his entire life, and now the something was here, and he was standing inside it, trying to feel what he had expected to feel. The steppe remembers everything. 1196 became 1199, and the great cruelty was called. Say that word softly. Cruelty. A gathering. The great gathering. The kind the Mongol world convened only when something permanent needed to happen, when the scattered pieces of a people needed to stand in one place and look at each other and acknowledge what had already become true. The location was the Onon River, the river of his childhood, the water he had fished for survival as a boy and hidden in as a young man and drunk from in gratitude and grief across a life that had never moved in the direction of comfortable. They came from every direction across the steppe, thousands of them, and the white felt and the horse herds and the smoke from 10,000 cooking fires turned that valley into something that looked from above, if you could have seen it from above, like a city made of moving parts. And there, in the year 1199 by most accounts, though some historians say 1206, and the argument between those dates has filled scholarly volumes, the gathered people of the Mongol world raised a great white standard of 9 yak tails and named Temujin something new, Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of those words has been debated since the moment they were spoken. Universal ruler is the most common translation. Oceanic ruler, some scholars prefer, something vast and without visible boundary. Neither translation quite holds the weight of what was being said, which is that this man was no longer a tribal chief or a regional power or a figure the settled world to the south could afford to monitor casually from behind its walls. He was something the steppe had not produced before in this particular form, and the name given to him said so without qualification. He was 40, or somewhere close to it. The years of his birth are uncertain enough that his age at this moment exists in a range, but he was not a young man anymore. The face that had been a boy's face on the Onon River had been worked over by decades of open air and cold and the specific kind of weathering that comes from a life spent outside. He moved with the economy of someone who had never had the luxury of wasted effort, and behind his eyes, by every account from people who met him in these years, there was that quality that had been there since childhood, the quality Sorkhan Shira had seen in the riverbank dark, that Day the Wise had noticed when a 9-year-old arrived at his camp, the feeling that he was thinking about something you hadn't thought of yet. Now, the answer to the question that has been waiting since part 2. What did he do with the people he conquered that nobody else was doing? What was the specific practice that confused and surprised everyone who encountered it for the first time? He absorbed them. Not symbolically, not in the vague way of a conqueror who says he welcomes new subjects and then treats them as a permanent second category of human being inside his world. He actually folded them in. A conquered soldier who had fought well became a Mongol soldier. A conquered craftsman who was exceptionally skilled was given status in the new structure based entirely on what he could do. A conquered administrator who understood how a particular city or territory worked kept administering it under Mongol authority, but with genuine operational responsibility. He did not care where you came from. He cared what you could do and whether you would be loyal to the structure he was building. This sounds unremarkable, stated plainly. In the context of the 12th and 13th century world, it was extraordinary. Civilizations of that era organized themselves around bloodline and tribe and religion and language, and the elaborate boundary keeping that made the difference between us and them visible and permanent. A man was what he was born. His category was fixed. The idea that a Tatar or a Naiman or a Kurait, or later a Chinese or a Persian, could become genuinely integrated into the same system as a Borjigin Mongol, based purely on ability and demonstrated loyalty, was not how the world worked. Genghis made it how his world worked.
And the compounding effect of this over decades was something that the settled kingdoms to the south and west would eventually discover with a shock that some of them never recovered from. Every people he conquered made him stronger. Their craftsmen built things his world hadn't had before. Their administrators understood systems of record and taxation and supply that the steppe had never needed and now suddenly did. Their soldiers added numbers and skills and geographic knowledge. Their scholars brought texts and ideas that his growing world began to need as it got too large to be run by memory and personal trust alone. He built a writing system for the Mongol language, borrowed the Uyghur script from captured Nayman scribes, and had his own sons taught it. He had no interest in literacy as an abstract virtue. He wanted records, wanted laws written down, wanted orders to travel accurately across distances that were getting too large for verbal transmission to stay clean. The smell of ink on felt, something that had never existed in this world before, quietly becoming part of its daily texture. And now, here is the fact that I want to sit with for a moment, the one that changes the picture most dramatically when you first encounter it. Because when most people think of Genghis Khan, what they see is the destruction, the campaigns, the cities that were left as fields of ash, the death tolls that historians still argue about and that are large enough to have measurably affected the climate of the medieval world by reducing human activity across entire regions. All of that is real. The destruction was real, and it was enormous, and it deserves to be stated without minimization. But across that same empire, at the same time, enforced by the same authority that sent armies across the Gobi Desert and into the heart of Central Asia, every religious community was protected, completely. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, shamanist scholars, Jewish communities, every single one. Clergy of all faiths were exempt from taxation. Religious buildings were protected from destruction when a city was taken. A man could practice whatever faith he had been born into or chosen without interference from any Mongol authority, including Genghis himself. He was a shamanist by practice, a man who spoke to the sky and the mountain and the spirits of the land the way his people had always done. He had his own beliefs, and they were genuine, and he extended to every other human being the same right to their genuine beliefs that he claimed for himself. In the 13th century world, that was not normal, it was not expected, and it was not a strategic calculation dressed up as principle. It was principle. His laws said so explicitly, and the enforcement was real. I keep coming back to this because it doesn't fit the image. It doesn't fit the story we've been given about this man, the one that starts and ends with the burning.
And every time I sit with this particular fact for a while, I find myself thinking about how often the full picture of a human being gets reduced to its most dramatic edges, how the parts that surprise us get quietly set aside because they don't serve the cleaner version of the story.
He was both things, genuinely. The destruction and the protection, the ruthlessness and the fairness, the man who boiled enemies alive by proxy, and the man who protected every mosque and monastery inside his world with equal seriousness. He held those contradictions the way the steppe holds winter and summer, not by resolving them, but by containing them inside something large enough to hold both. The steppe remembers everything. You're still here. Let yourself feel that. Let the night settle around you a little more. The campaigns began in earnest after the Great Gathering. The first direction was south, Shisha, the Tangut kingdom sitting between the Mongol homeland and the larger prize of the Jin dynasty of northern China, a sophisticated state with cities and walls and armies and the accumulated confidence of a civilization that had never had to seriously reconsider its own permanence. The Tanguts had ignored Mongol requests for submission the way a stone wall ignores weather. They were about to learn that weather, given enough time and enough accumulated force, wins. The Shisha campaigns began around 1209. The Mongol army that moved south across the Gobi was something no one on the other side had built a mental model for. These were not raiders. Raiders came and took things and left. This force arrived with intent, with engineering knowledge borrowed from captured experts, with siege equipment that had no business being on the back of steppe horses. They surrounded cities. They diverted rivers to flood walls. They waited with a patience that city defenders found more psychologically difficult than any assault. The sound of that army moving, 10,000 horses at dawn, the ground absorbing the rhythm of it, the dust rising in a column visible from 30 miles. Shisha submitted, partially. The Tangut king agreed to terms and paid tribute and sent a daughter to Genghis's court and watched the Mongol army turn north again with the specific relief of a man who doesn't fully understand that what he just agreed to is only the beginning of a relationship he cannot exit. The Jin dynasty was the larger target, the northern Chinese empire that the Jurchen people had built after displacing the earlier Liao dynasty, a sophisticated and heavily defended civilization with a standing army numbering in the hundreds of thousands and a network of fortified cities that had been built specifically to discourage exactly the kind of steppe-based aggression that was now arriving at its northern walls. The Jin emperors had been extracting tribute from the Mongols for generations, treating the steppe peoples with the particular disdain that settled agricultural civilizations reserve for nomads who don't write things down. Genghis presented himself at the Jin border in 1211 and sent word ahead of him, the way he always did, offering terms: submit, acknowledge his authority, pay tribute, and be absorbed into the structure he was building. The alternative was explicit and not theatrical. He meant it exactly as stated. The Jin rejected him. What followed across the next several years was one of the most sustained military campaigns of the medieval world, and the details of how the Mongol army adapted to an entirely new kind of warfare, siege warfare against stone cities in a climate and terrain nothing in their history had prepared them for, is where you see the specific quality of the military mind that Genghis had built. He used Chinese engineers he had captured.
He used Jurchen defectors who brought tactical knowledge from inside the system they were abandoning. He watched how his own forces performed and adjusted based on what he saw rather than on what doctrine said should work. He was interested in what actually worked, always. The Jin capitals, Zhongdu among them, fell across this period in ways that still stagger the historical imagination. A city that had believed itself permanently protected by its walls and its army discovered that permanence is only as real as the size of the force you're imagining when you build your walls. And here, in those campaigns, comes the moment I want to ask you about. Not as a historian asking a question into empty space, as someone who has spent a long time with this story and keeps returning to a specific thing. There is a point in the Jin campaigns where Genghis received news that a city had surrendered its gates without a fight, had sent its officials out to meet him with documents and keys and all the correct gestures of submission, and he stood there with his generals and made a decision that by the logic of his world and his moment he didn't have to make. He could have taken the city's wealth and left. He could have installed a Mongol governor and moved on. What he did instead was ask the city what it needed. He sent administrators to assess the water system, the grain stores, the tax structure. He asked questions about the local governance that an outside conqueror has no obligation to ask. And I wonder sometimes, sitting with that particular moment, whether you have ever felt something like what I imagine he felt in it. That specific, complicated weight of having more power than you expected to end up with, and the quiet question of what a decent person does with power they didn't design their character around holding. The gap between who you were when you were fighting for survival and who the world now needs you to be. Whether the person who survived the wooden Kang and the frozen river and Dalen Balzut and Baljuna was equipped to be this. Whether the tools you built for one kind of life translate cleanly into another. Tell me in the comments if that question means something to you. I read every single one. I always have. The Jin campaigns created something that hadn't existed in the world before, a Mongol administrative structure capable of running settled territory at scale. He brought in a Khitan advisor named Yelyu Chuchai, a scholar of genuine brilliance who would eventually become one of the most important administrators in Mongol history, and whose job in those early years was essentially to translate the logic of settled civilization into terms that a steppe-based authority could use without destroying what made the civilization worth keeping.
Yelyu Chuchai said to Genghis at one point words that historians have argued about ever since in terms of whether he actually said them or whether the record smoothed them into a cleaner form. The substance of what he said was this: you can conquer an empire on horseback. You cannot govern it on horseback. The two skills are different. The second is harder. Genghis listened. This was not guaranteed. A man who had spent 40 years being right about everything he needed to be right about to survive had every reason to dismiss the advice of a captured scholar from a civilization he had just defeated. That he didn't, that he took the advice seriously and found structural use for it, is one of the things that separates what he built from every other steppe empire that came before and burned bright and collapsed within a generation. The steppe remembers everything. The direction changed. West. The word that had been reaching the Mongol court from the trade routes for years was that there was an empire out there in the direction of the setting sun that was something to take seriously. The Khwarezmian Empire, a Persian-speaking Muslim sultanate of enormous territorial reach, covering most of what is now Iran and Central Asia, with a sultan named Muhammad who had assembled a force large enough that the settled world generally regarded him as one of the 2 or 3 most powerful men alive.
Genghis sent a trade caravan first, a large one, 450 men, mostly Muslim merchants, carrying Mongol goods along the Silk Road routes into Khwarezmian territory, carrying also an implied message. We are interested in trade. We are interested in a relationship built on commercial exchange rather than the alternative. The governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, looked at that caravan and decided it was a spy mission dressed as commerce. He had all 450 men killed and took their goods. Muhammad, when informed, did not punish Inalchuk. Genghis sent ambassadors to the Sultan, 3 men, a Mongol and 2 Muslims, carrying a message that was formal and entirely clear. Return the goods, hand over Inalchuk, acknowledge responsibility for what had been done. The Sultan had the Mongol ambassador killed and shaved the heads of the 2 Muslim ambassadors and sent them back. There is a specific kind of silence that comes over a man when something he has offered in good faith is answered with contempt. What Genghis did in the days after that silence is not fully recorded. What we know is that he went alone to a mountain. The old sources say he stayed there 3 days and 3 nights, fasting, praying to the sky in the way of his people, asking for rightness of purpose before he did what he was about to do. Whether this was genuine spiritual preparation or a form of self-examination that was genuinely more than strategic calculation, nobody can say from 8 centuries away. But the accounts that survived describe a man who came down from that mountain with a quality of absolute stillness that the people around him recognized as different from his usual stillness. He gathered the largest force he had ever assembled. Some sources say 200,000 soldiers, some say closer to 150,000. The numbers shift depending on who was counting and what they were counting, but every account agrees that what crossed into Khwarezmian territory in 1219 was something the world had not seen organized and moving with coordinated purpose before. He did not attack from one direction. He never did. 4 columns spreading across an enormous front aimed at separate targets simultaneously, coordinated by a communication system built on fast riders and relay horses, and a signal system that could carry orders across hundreds of miles faster than any army trying to respond to those orders could move. Sultan Muhammad had expected to meet one large Mongol force at his border and fight it in the conventional manner that large armies fought. Instead, he found himself facing simultaneous threats from multiple directions that his supply lines and communication structures weren't built to respond to at the same time. The warm stone of a city wall before it falls, the smell of the desert in the last quiet hour before dawn. Samarkand fell, one of the most beautiful cities in the medieval world, a center of Islamic learning and culture and trade that had been called the Pearl of the East and the Garden of Souls, and a dozen other names that all tried to hold something that names can't quite hold. It was a city of several 100,000 people, great mosques, libraries, an astronomical tradition, a mercantile life that connected east and west along the Silk Road in ways that had been generating wealth and knowledge for centuries. It fell in 1220 after a short siege. Genghis did what he always did when a city surrendered after resistance. He separated the population by what they were and what they could offer. Craftsmen and scholars and administrators were taken north. Soldiers who had fought against him were killed. The general population was processed by a formula that was brutal and consistent, and that the people inside those cities had no framework to understand before it arrived, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. But the mosques stood. The surviving scholars were treated as resources. The administrative structure of the city was rebuilt and put back to work. This was not mercy. It was the same practical intelligence applied everywhere. Genghis needed Samarkand to function. A city of ash doesn't generate revenue or supply an army on the move. Sultan fled. He was chased by a Mongol detachment across his own empire, from city to city, watching his world dissolve behind him, and he died on a small island in the Caspian Sea in 1221, alone, reportedly wrapped in a stranger's shirt, because nobody had thought to pack imperial robes for a man in full flight from everything he'd built. His son, Jalal ad-Din, was different, braver, or perhaps simply more willing to die facing the right direction. He made a final stand on the banks of the Indus River with a force of 30,000 men against a Mongol army coming down on him from the north, and fought well enough that by several accounts Genghis stopped on the bank after the battle and pointed at the retreating Jalal ad-Din, who had jumped his horse off a cliff into the Indus rather than be captured, and turned to his sons and said, "That was a son worth having." He let him go. This is one of those moments that historians note carefully because it doesn't fit any strategic explanation. Jalal ad-Din was a genuine military talent who had just demonstrated in front of everyone that he could command men in desperate circumstances and make them fight beyond what desperate circumstances normally permit. Letting him go was not tactically obvious. It might have been the closest thing to admiration that Genghis allowed himself to express toward an enemy in his entire life.
The campaign across Khwarezm lasted 3 years and ended with the Sultanate effectively dissolved. Its territory became Mongol administrative space. Its trade routes became Mongol trade routes. Its scholars and craftsmen began the slow process of being integrated into the structure that was now too large to describe as an empire of the steppe. It was something else now, something that didn't have a clean name yet. 200 years of Silk Road cities compressed into the noise of 3 years. The steppe remembers everything. He was in his 50s now, the body that had been formed by a childhood of near starvation and decades of campaigns in every climate, from the Gobi to the Iranian plateau, was still moving, still in the saddle, still present at the decisions that mattered. But the scale of what he was managing had grown past what any single human being could hold in complete detail. And he knew it, and the fact that he knew it, rather than pretending otherwise, was itself a form of intelligence. He had begun the process of thinking about what came after him, not in the way of a man planning to die, but in the way of a man who understands that everything he has built is only as permanent as the structure he puts in place to outlast him. He had 4 sons by Borte. Jochi, the eldest, with the question around his birth that had never fully closed. Chagatai, second, fierce and principled and deeply committed to the letter of Mongol law in ways that were admirable and rigid in equal measure. Ogadei, third, warm and politically gifted, and the one Genghis had already privately decided was most suited to carry the whole weight of what would need carrying. And Tolui, the youngest of the 4, who stayed closest to his father, who was present at more of the campaigns than any of the others, who absorbed more of the direct education that proximity to Genghis produced. He divided the world between them in his mind, the way a man divides land, knowing the boundaries he draws will outlast his ability to enforce them. Borte was still at the center of the household. Older now, the girl from Daisei the Wise's camp, barely visible in the face of the woman who had been through what she had been through, and come out the other side still standing with the same quality of steadiness she'd always had. Genghis had other wives, many others by this point.
It was the world he lived in, and the practice of it was political as much as personal. But the accounts are consistent about where his actual counsel came from. Borte told him things other people didn't dare, and he listened in ways he didn't always listen to generals. There is something quietly true in that across all the distance of the centuries. There is a detail from those years of the Western campaign that I want to set down here because it changes the texture of the picture. One of his generals, Subutai, and his son, Jebe, had been given permission to pursue Muhammad westward, and in the course of that pursuit they had gone further west than any Mongol force before them, swinging north of the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, into the steppes north of the Black Sea, fighting Georgians and Cumans, and finally a combined Russian force at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. They won every engagement. Then they turned around and came back.
Genghis absorbed the intelligence of what they had found. A world to the west, much larger than anything the Mongol imagination had mapped, full of kingdoms and armies and cities, organized differently from anything the Central Asian campaigns had encountered, with its own political structures and its own military traditions, and its own confident assumption that the edges of the known world were far away and not its immediate concern. He filed it. He didn't act on it in his lifetime, but he filed it in the way of someone who has learned to let the right moment find the right information, rather than forcing the timing before the conditions are ready. Outside somewhere, the deep cold of a night moving toward its quietest hour, the stars above the steppe exactly as they were. He went back to Shisha, the Tangut kingdom that had submitted years earlier and had not been as loyal in the interval as the terms of their submission required. There had been refusals to send soldiers when called, communications that had the specific quality of a kingdom that had decided it could manage its relationship with the Mongol world on its own schedule. Genghis did not receive that kind of message without eventually responding to it, and by 1226 he was personally leading the campaign south again, back toward the walls and the desert crossing, and the kingdom that had miscalculated its own importance. He was sick during this campaign, not visibly, not in any way that he allowed his soldiers or his generals to fully see, but the sources that survived from close to him in these years describe a man managing something in his body that wasn't cooperating the way it always had. There had been a hunting accident, a fall from a horse that had done more internal damage than the official story admitted. He was sleeping, some accounts say, more than he used to sleep, the body finding the rest the decades had earned. He kept moving anyway. The campaign against Shisha was not something he was willing to hand to a general while he recovered somewhere warm and waited. He had always been present. He would be present now. The Tangut king, facing the reality of a Mongol army on his doorstep, with Genghis himself at its head, tried a last round of negotiations. He sent word that he would submit, that terms could be arranged, that the formal surrender could be structured in a way that preserved something of the dignity of the occasion. The reply from the Mongol side was measured and cold, and made clear that the time for that particular conversation had passed some years ago. The Shisha capital was under siege. The walls were holding for now, holding the way things hold when they haven't yet absorbed the full weight of what's pressing against them.
and somewhere inside those walls, the Tangut king was trying to calculate whether something remained that could be salvaged from the wreckage of a relationship his predecessors had spent years quietly undermining. And Genghis, somewhere in the siege camp outside those walls, was lying in the dark of his tent at the edge of sleep, with the distant sound of the army around him and the smell of the desert night coming through the felt walls, and the specific quiet of a man who has been many things across a very long life and is not yet done being all of them. Not yet, not quite finished with the particular kind of silence that asks nothing of you.
That is where the night found him. Not peacefully, not with the settled quality of a man who has made his accounting with the world and found the numbers balanced. Something more restless than that. Something that had been restless his entire life and had simply learned, across the decades, to wear stillness as its outer surface. The steppe remembers everything. Here's the third question, the one historians argue about most quietly because it sits at the center of everything else and refuses to resolve cleanly. When Genghis Khan died, he left specific instructions about his burial, instructions so precise and so deliberately designed to be carried out in secret that they succeeded. Completely, his tomb has never been found, not in 800 years of looking. And here is what makes that fact more than just an interesting footnote. He didn't keep his burial secret because he feared grave robbers, though that may have been part of it. The old sources suggest something different, something more personal, something that has to do with what he believed the earth itself was for, and what he believed happened to a man's spirit when the physical world was finally done with him. What did Genghis Khan believe happened to him after death, and why did that belief require that no one ever find where he went? Hold that. The answer is coming, but not yet. Let it sit in the dark with you for a while. He was lying in his tent on the edge of the Shisha siege, and the thing in his body that had been pressing against him for months was pressing harder now. Not with the blunt urgency of a wound or a fever that announces itself loudly, with the quieter insistence of something that has decided the conversation between a man and his body is approaching its last chapter and would prefer to be acknowledged. He had been in this position before, adjacent to his own mortality, close enough to feel the temperature change, at the Kulka campaign aftermath, after the hunting fall, after certain battles in the Jin campaigns where the gap between what happened and what could have happened was narrow enough to see through. Each time he had come back from that edge, and the coming back had changed something in him, added some layer of understanding that the man who hadn't been that close to the edge didn't have access to. But this was different in quality from those other times. He called for Ogode. His third son arrived, and the two of them were alone together for a period that none of the sources measure precisely, because this was not an official meeting that had official scribes present. What passed between them in that tent is reconstructed from later accounts, from what Ogode remembered and chose to share, which means it comes to us filtered through the grief and the weight of succession and the specific things a son chooses to remember about a father's last coherent hours. But certain things come through. He told Ogode about fear. Not his own fear, specifically. Not in those words. He talked about the fear he had seen in the faces of the men around him across the decades. The particular fear that the people closest to power feel. The fear of being the person who tells the powerful man something true that the powerful man doesn't want to hear. He had watched it happen in councils, in campaigns, and quiet morning conversations for 40 years. the way men with genuine intelligence would look at him and calculate, before opening their mouths, whether what they actually thought was something he would reward or punish. The way that calculation, visible in the half-second pause before the words, slowly produced a world in which nobody told him anything except versions of what they thought he already believed. He said to Ogode, "The most dangerous thing a man in your position will face is not the enemy outside the wall. It is the silence inside your own council." This is the kind of thing that a man says when he has been honest enough with himself, in the dark hours when honesty is the only available company, to admit where he himself had failed. He was not a man who admitted failure easily or often. The fact that he said this, that this specific warning is what he chose to spend some portion of his final coherent hours on, suggests he had sat with his own version of that failure long enough to know exactly what it cost. There were things he couldn't fix from a tent on the edge of a siege. The mirror moment. This one. Here is what the private record suggests about the man inside the titles and the campaigns. He was afraid of dogs. Not metaphorically, not as an expression, but genuinely and physically frightened of dogs in a way that the people closest to him knew and carefully managed around. A man who had faced siege warfare and steppe winters and the full military force of multiple civilizations had this specific, ordinary fear that never left him from childhood. He missed his mother. Not as a sentiment, as a present-tense experience that the sources describe in his later years with a specificity that makes it feel true rather than constructed. He would speak of Hoyland in terms that didn't match the emotional register of most of his other speech. Quieter, more direct, without the strategic framing that he applied to most human relationships, because strategic framing was how he navigated most human relationships. With her, he seemed to have simply been something younger and more undefended. She had died while he was on campaign. He hadn't been there. This is one of those facts that arrives quietly in the historical record and doesn't announce how much it contains. A man who had organized his entire life around presence at the moments that mattered had been absent from the one that probably mattered more to him personally than any council or campaign. She had raised him on pine nuts and river water, and the specific courage of someone who had decided that the world taking things from her was not the last word on who she was. She had watched him become something she couldn't have imagined on that winter plain when the clan rode away and left them in the cold. Whether she was proud, in the complicated way of a mother who loves her child completely and also sees exactly what it cost him and everyone around him to become what he became, the sources don't say. He never said, at least not in anything that survived. And now, the rewatch trigger. Go back for a moment to the boy we met at the beginning of this story. The 9-year-old on the Mongolian steppe, with his father's body cooling in the grass, and the whole clan riding away, and his mother standing in the dust of their departure, trying not to let her children see what was happening in her face. Go back to the detail about how Holun came to be his mother at all, how she was taken from another man on her wedding journey, how Yesugai rode toward a woman who belonged to someone else and took her and rode away, and that man, her first husband, was left watching the dust with nothing in his hands but the memory of what he'd had an hour before. Now hear this. One of the earliest laws Genghis codified, one of the very first things he put into the structure of his growing world, when he had the authority to make law that would be enforced, was a complete prohibition on the kidnapping of women. Not a restriction, a prohibition with teeth. The specific act that had made his own existence possible was the first thing he made illegal in the world he built. He had grown up inside the consequences of that taking, had watched his mother carry the specific knowledge of it her entire life, had understood from very close range what it meant to be a woman whose future had been rearranged by force without anyone asking whether she had an opinion. He had the power to make sure it didn't happen again inside his world, and he used it. If you heard the opening of this story knowing that, you heard it differently. The boy on the step becomes someone else, or becomes more fully who he already was, a child born of a wound in the world, who grew up to put a law in the exact shape of that wound, so nobody else would have to be born into the same particular darkness. The step remembers everything. His faith was something the outside world has always struggled to categorize. He was a Tengrist, a believer in the eternal blue sky, Tengri, the great overarching spirit that his people had named and spoken to and organized their spiritual lives around since before the oldest memory. The sky was not metaphor for him, it was presence, real and attentive and capable of being addressed directly if you did it correctly and honestly. He prayed, not occasionally, not ceremonially in the way of a man performing religion for the audience of his subjects. He prayed alone, on mountains and riverbanks, and in the dark of his tent before battles, with a directness that the sources describe as conversation more than petition. He seemed to believe, genuinely, that the sky listened and occasionally answered, though the answers came in the form of events rather than voices. He also believed with equal conviction that every other person's relationship with whatever they called the ultimate reality deserved exactly the same protection as his own. This is not a small thing. This is not the tolerant indifference of someone who doesn't care about religion. This is a man with a genuine and active faith, explicitly choosing to extend to every other faith the same dignity he wanted for his own. He had conversations with Taoist monks, with Nestorian Christian priests, with Muslim scholars. The accounts of these conversations suggest genuine curiosity rather than diplomatic performance. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He didn't convert. He didn't need to. He seemed to believe that the sky was large enough to hold all of the names people had given it, and that the arguing about names was a human problem rather than a divine one. A Taoist monk named Chu Ji traveled thousands of miles to meet him during the Khwarezmian campaign, an old man making an extraordinary journey because Genghis had invited him, had sent the invitation with the specific phrasing that he wished to hear the monk's understanding of how a man should live and what happens after living is done. The conversation they had across several meetings is partially preserved. Genghis asked about immortality. The monk told him honestly that he had no secret for avoiding death, only for living correctly up until death, that physical immortality was not achievable, that a long and meaningful life was. Genghis received this without the anger that a man who wanted a different answer might have shown. He seemed, by the monk's own account, relieved, as if the honest answer was more useful to him than a comfortable lie would have been. He was always more comfortable with honest answers than comfortable lies, even when the honest answer was the harder one. The cold air moving through the felt walls, the particular quality of a lamp burning low in a large space. He thought about death more than the public record shows. This is one of those things that lives in the gaps of the official account, in the details that got written down because they were too specific to be invented. The burial instructions are the largest of those gaps. He wanted to be returned to the earth without a marker, without ceremony that would leave a visible trace. He wanted the ground to close over him the way water closes over a stone, completely, without a surface disturbance that lasted. He chose a place he had loved, the mountain Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain where he had prayed after the Merkit raid, where he had hidden in the trees while the search parties moved along the tree line below, where he had felt the mountain itself as something alive and attentive and personal. He had returned to that mountain repeatedly across his life, always alone or nearly alone, always for the kind of conversation that can't happen in a crowd. He said once, in words that survived in the secret history, that Burkhan Khaldun had protected his life when he was a frightened young man with nothing, and that he wanted to give his life back to it when the time came. This is not the language of strategy. This is the language of a man talking about something he loves. The soldiers who carried out the burial, the sources agree, were themselves killed afterward so that the location couldn't be transmitted. Whether Genghis ordered this or whether it was done without him knowing, history doesn't resolve clearly. The practical effect was the same. The ground took him and closed over him, and the 800 years since have been unable to open it. In a world that puts markers on everything, that names mountains and rivers and cities after the people who mattered, the man who mattered most in terms of sheer historical scale has no stone with his name on it anywhere on the surface of the earth. There is something in that which is either deeply sad or deeply right, and it might be both simultaneously. He had a tenderness for animals that sits awkwardly alongside everything else in the record. Not the performative affection of powerful men who keep exotic beasts as symbols of dominance. A quieter thing. He had a gray horse he had ridden for years that he refused to replace when it aged past usefulness, and his generals thought it was an odd attachment for a man in his position. He kept it. He fed it himself on campaign when the handlers were busy with other things. He loved the steppe in the way that you can only love the thing that made you, that was present at your formation before you had words for what formation was. The specific quality of Mongolian light in late afternoon, when the grass goes golden and the shadows stretch long, and the sky turns the particular shade of deep blue that Tengri was named for. He referenced this in conversations across his life in ways that weren't connected to any strategic purpose, which means they were genuine. He was homesick, not in the usual sense. A man who spent most of his adult life on campaign in territories further and further from the Onon River carried that specific ache of the original landscape that never fully resolves, the knowledge that the place where you first understood what the world was is both permanently with you and permanently behind you. His relationship with his sons was complicated in the ways that relationships between enormously powerful fathers and sons who need to become their own people always are, and also in ways specific to this particular family. Jochi was the wound that never fully closed. Not because Genghis loved him less. The evidence suggests the opposite, that he was careful with Jochi in a way that had the quality of compensation, of a man who knows that someone near him is carrying an unfair weight and trying quietly to redistribute it without drawing attention to the redistribution. But the question around Jochi's birth had done its work on Chagatai in particular, the second son, who had made his opinion clear in a way that couldn't be unmade.
The family held the tension of it the way a joint holds a fracture, functional, but never quite the same as before. The specific grief of watching your children hurt each other and knowing that the wound is partly yours and not being able to close it with any of the tools that have worked on every other problem you've ever faced. He had that grief. He sat with it. He didn't fix it. The years of the Shisha campaign pressed on. The city walls were holding, but the people inside them were starting to feel the mathematics of a siege that was not going to lift. Genghis moved through those weeks with the specific economy of a man who is managing the energy available to him with more care than he used to need to. He ate less. He slept in shorter intervals, but more of them. The people around him registered these changes and said nothing, because saying something would have required a courage the situation didn't support. Borte was not with him. She was north, in the homeland, where she stayed now, the distances of campaign having long since become too large for a woman of her age to travel routinely. He sent riders with messages. She sent riders back. The content of what passed between them in those last months isn't preserved in any source I'm aware of, and perhaps that's correct. Some correspondences deserve to remain private.
But there's a detail from this final period that the sources do preserve. He asked repeatedly that she be told what was happening, not the official version, not the version that would be crafted for the historical record and the comfort of the succession, the actual version. A man who had spent his life in the specific loneliness of responsibility was, in its final hours, trying to let one person see him clearly before the record closed. You have heard about the birth, the clenched fist, the dark clot of blood in the newborn hand, the shamans who said this child was marked. Here is what Genghis said about that in his old age, in a conversation preserved in fragments that historians argue about but can't quite dismiss. He said he didn't believe the sign had been about greatness. He said he believed, looking back from the end of a life that had contained more violence and more tenderness and more fear and more love than any tidy account could hold, that the sign had been about holding. That his whole life he had been trying to hold things, hold his family together in the winter with no fire, hold his people together after they scattered, hold the alliances that everyone said would break, hold the empire together past the point where its own weight should have pulled it apart. He said the fist was the first true picture of him, not the armies or the law or the name the gathered world had given him. The infant hand clenched around something already before he knew what anything was, trying not to let go. The mirror moment. You have held something like that. Everyone has. Something you gripped past the point where gripping made sense, because the alternative was open in your hand, and that felt too much like agreeing that the loss was real. A relationship, a version of yourself, an idea of how your life was supposed to go, something that the world wanted you to put down and that your hand refused. That specific refusal, the one that is not logic and not strategy and not optimism about how things will turn out, just the pure animal insistence of a closed hand on the thing it holds. He died with that quality intact, still gripping, still trying to keep the shape of the world he had made from dissolving back into the chaos that had been trying to claim it from the beginning. And here is what the record nearly lost, the thing that exists in only one surviving source, and that I want you to hear, because it is the most human detail in all of this. In the last coherent conversations that the people closest to him recorded, someone, the sources don't agree on who, asked him what he was most proud of, what, across a life that had redrawn the map of the known world, he considered the thing that mattered most.
He did not name a battle. He did not name a territory. He said, by most accounts, the people who stayed.
That was the answer. Quiet, specific, not designed for an audience. The people who had chosen him at the fork in the road when the practical choice would have been the other direction. The men who had drunk muddy water with him at Baljuna. Sorkon Shira, who had hidden a runaway slave in a cartload of wool because something in the runaway's eyes asked for it. Borte, who had waited for a young man with no horses and no prospects because something in her knew the waiting was the right investment. The thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who had looked at the world he was building and decided to live inside it. Power, he seemed to be saying at the end, had been the means. The people had been the point. He didn't say it with any grandeur. There's no evidence of a dramatic final speech or a composed farewell that wrapped everything into meaning. What comes through from the fragments is something quieter. A man in a tent with the sounds of a siege outside, trying to get a few last things said accurately before accuracy was no longer available to him. The Shisha walls were still standing. He had been lying still for more hours than usual. The tent was warm with the heat of careful attendance and a fire that had been kept specifically against the desert cold of the nights, which dropped fast and far at this latitude and this time of year. He could hear, or perhaps only remember hearing, the sound of horses at rest, the specific breathing of an army camped around its center, thousands of separate lives arranged in concentric circles of loyalty around the one point that gave the whole arrangement its meaning. The sky was enormous above the tent walls. He knew that without seeing it. The sky was always enormous above wherever he happened to be, and he had always found that fact more comforting than threatening, which perhaps said something about the difference between a man who feared the infinite and a man who had made his peace with belonging to it. He had one more request, one thing he asked the general standing at the edge of visibility in his tent to ensure. The Shisha campaign was to be completed. Whatever was coming for him personally, the work was not to be set aside. The army was to stay in its position. The siege was to continue, and when the city fell, if he was not there to see it, he was to be reported as present anyway. The enemy was not to know he was gone until there was no longer any military reason to conceal it. A last act of tactical thinking from a man whose body was beyond tactics. A last insistence that the work mattered more than the man who had started it. The generals agreed and stepped back, and the tent settled into the particular quality of quiet that comes before something large and irreversible, a quiet that is full rather than empty, weighted with everything that is about to change and hasn't changed yet, the last breath of a world still holding the shape its maker gave it. He died in August of 1227. The exact date shifts depending on the source. The exact cause shifts too. The hunting fall, some say, an internal illness, others, a fever brought on by the campaign's conditions, according to a third account. The sources were deliberately vague because the men who knew had been instructed to be vague, and the men who hadn't been instructed understood anyway that the truth of this particular moment was not something to be announced into the open air before the army had completed its work. The tent held the silence of it. Outside, the siege continued.
Inside, the people who had been closest to him moved through the necessary hours with the specific, controlled grief of soldiers who have orders to follow and know that following them is itself a form of honoring the man who gave them. They wrapped him, They prepared him for the journey north, and they told no one outside the innermost circle that anything had changed. The steppe remembers everything. The Shija capital fell not long after. The last Tangut king, who had been negotiating terms and hoping that patience would produce a more favorable outcome than stubbornness had, came out of his city to submit. What happened to him in the days after that submission is recorded with varying detail across the sources, but the outcome was consistent with what Genghis had decided years before the final campaign began. The Tangut kingdom, as a political entity, was finished. Then the army turned north, carrying something that most of the soldiers didn't know they were carrying, moving across the desert in the direction of home, toward the Onan River and the mountain and the place that had been waiting for him since the day a frightened boy had hidden in its trees and felt the mountain breathe. And now, the answer to the third question, the one about death and the burial that left no mark, and what he believed was waiting on the other side of the last breath. He believed in return. Not in the afterlife constructed by the settled religions he had spent his life listening to with genuine curiosity, not in paradise or judgment or the specific architecture of reward and punishment that those faiths organized themselves around. He believed in something older and less structured. He believed that the sky had made him and that the earth had shaped him, and that the work of being a man was done. The sky and the earth simply took back what had always been theirs. The Mongol understanding of spirit was not fixed in one location. It was not attached to a body or a name or a place. It moved. It returned to the great blue above and the deep soil below, and became part of the enormous unmarked everything that surrounds the small marked things that human beings spend their lives trying to build. A grave marker in this understanding was not an honor, it was a mistake. It was the living world insisting that the departed belonged to one square of ground rather than to everything. It was the same impulse that builds walls and draws borders and says this far and no further applied to something that had never agreed to be contained. He didn't want to be contained. He never had. The soldiers who carried him north were instructed to let nothing mark the passage, no broken branches, no disturbed ground beyond what was necessary. The accounts say they drove horses over the burial site afterward, so the earth would show nothing but the ordinary evidence of an army that had passed through. Some accounts say a forest was planted. Some say the river was diverted across it. Some say simply that the mountain took him, the way mountains take things, quietly, without ceremony, without requiring any acknowledgement from the thing being taken.
What is certain is this: 800 years of searching by archaeologists and scholars and treasure hunters and governments and satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have found nothing. The earth closed over him completely. The sky received whatever the sky was owed, and the mountain, Burkhan Khaldun, stands today in northeastern Mongolia exactly as it stood then, sacred, protected, a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, which is its own kind of historical joke, and it says nothing to anyone about where in its body the man is resting. He got what he asked for. He belonged to everything. The warm stone of that mountain in afternoon light, the enormous silence of a place that knows something the rest of the world is still trying to find out. The news of his death was released when Ogodei was in position to receive it properly. It traveled outward from the center of the empire in every direction at once, and the world it reached was genuinely different from the world that had existed when he was born.
60 years of accumulated campaigns and absorptions and lawmaking and trade routes and administrative structures had produced something that covered more of the earth than any political entity before it in all of recorded history. The empire he left contained the territory of modern China, Korea, much of Russia, Iran, Iraq, parts of Poland and Hungary, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia in its entirety. Not all of it consolidated in his lifetime. The Western campaigns he had filed in the back of his mind after the Khalkha River Report would be completed by his grandsons and his generals in the decades after him. But the architecture of all of it was his. The decimal military system, the protected trade routes, the law that applied equally regardless of origin, the religious tolerance that made it possible for a Muslim merchant and a Buddhist monk and an Nestorian priest to travel the same road under the same protection. The Pax Mongolica, historians call the period after him, the Mongol Peace, a period of approximately a century when the Silk Road functioned with a safety and efficiency it hadn't known before and wouldn't know again for a very long time, when goods and ideas and diseases and people moved between China and Europe with a freedom of passage that remade both ends of the route. Let yourself feel the size of that for a moment, just the size of it, without any of the other feelings that come attached to it. Ogodei became the second great Khan. He was, as his father had judged, the son best suited to the work of governing rather than conquering. He built a permanent capital at Karakorum, a city the Mongol world had never had before, and that symbolized in its very existence the transformation of something nomadic into something that was choosing, deliberately, to stay in one place long enough to build walls. He continued his father's campaigns in directions the map still had room to absorb. Jochi had died before his father, the precise circumstances debated, the question around his birth following him all the way to the end. His portion of the empire passed to his son Batu, who completed the Western campaigns and reached the gates of Vienna before turning back, not because he was defeated, but because news from the East required his presence. Europe looked at the retreating Mongol force and called it a miracle. It was logistics. Chagatai held Central Asia. Tolui, who had stayed closest, held the Mongol homeland in the traditional way of the youngest son who inherits the hearth. His descendants would include Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of China and became the subject of Marco Polo's extraordinary account, and who built the Yuan dynasty and made Beijing the center of an empire that connected East and West more completely than anything before it. The steppe remembers everything. But all of that was after. In the moment of the death, before the succession resolved itself into the shapes that history would eventually give it, there was just the fact of a man who had been in the world for 60-something years and was now no longer in it. The tent, the army that didn't know yet, the enormous Mongolian sky above everything, the same sky it had always been, the same sky that a 9-year-old had looked up at on the Onan River with his father's body nearby and the clan's dust settling on the horizon. Full circle. Life has a way of completing shapes you didn't know it was drawing. Borte outlived him. She lived into her 70s by most accounts, which in the 13th century world was a life of considerable length, and she spent the years of his absence at the center of the household she had always been at the center of, the steady point around which everything else had arranged itself. What she thought about in the long mornings after he was gone, nobody recorded. What she felt is not available to us. She left no document, no account, no letter that survived. She was present at the beginning and absent from the official record at the end,
the way the most important things often are. Hoyland, too, had outlived her particular chapter, dying while he was still on campaign, the woman who had fed 6 children on river roots and pine nuts in a winter that should have killed all of them, who had built something out of nothing, using only the materials the world had left her after it took everything else. He had not been there when she died, and he had carried that absence for the rest of his life, the way you carry the specific weight of something you cannot go back and change. That specific weight. Here's a mirror moment, the last one I'll offer you in this story, and I want to give it to you directly because you deserve the honest version. Every person who has ever lost someone before they were ready, which is everyone because no one is ever fully ready, carries a version of what Genghis carried with him from the day he came home from campaign and found his mother gone. The particular shape of a conversation that didn't happen because you assumed there was more time. The things you meant to say that are now permanently unsaid. The last image you have of someone isn't the one you would have chosen if you'd known it was the last. He was a man who was present at everything that mattered strategically and tactically and politically. He was absent at the thing that mattered personally, and he knew it. And knowing it didn't fix it, and all the power in the world didn't fix it. You have felt that, maybe not with the same stakes, maybe not on the same scale, but in the same room of the human experience, the room where competence ends and grief begins, where the tools you've spent a life building turn out not to be the right tools for the thing in front of you.
He was there too. He sat in that room too. And there is something oddly comforting in that. The way it's oddly comforting to know that the largest and most defended human beings who ever lived still had rooms inside them that nothing could protect. Still had the ordinary wounds. Still had the mother they didn't get to say goodbye to. The cold blue of a Mongolian autumn sky pressing down on everything below it, equal and enormous and indifferent to scale. Now here is something smaller and true that I want to leave with you before the end of this night. There was a tradition in the Mongol world, one of the practices that ran through the daily life of the camps and the households and the moving cities of felt, of pausing at certain hours of the day to simply look at the sky. Not to pray, necessarily, not to ask for anything, just to look, to register the fact of the sky's presence above whatever was happening at ground level, to remember the proportion between the enormous and the small. Genghis did this his entire life, in the middle of campaigns, in the middle of councils, in the middle of conversations. People who knew him described it not as distraction, but as recalibration, a brief returning to the original scale of things before going back to the work of the immediate scale. A man checking in with what was permanent before returning to what was temporary. He taught his sons to do it. Some of them did. The practice traveled with the empire in fragments, turning up in accounts from Persia and China and the Caucasus, this small, specific habit of a man on the Mongolian steppe that had made its way into the daily life of people who had never seen the steppe and never would. The smallest things travel furthest sometimes.
The succession held imperfectly for the length of a human generation, which was longer than most successions of comparable empires had managed. It eventually fractured in the ways that empires fracture, into the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, 4 enormous political bodies, each carrying pieces of what had been one thing,
each eventually going the direction of its own particular geography and culture, becoming more Persian, more Chinese, more Russian, more Central Asian, until the Mongol origin was a thread in the fabric rather than the whole cloth. But the thread never fully disappeared. The steppe remembers everything. There is a genetic study published in the year 2003 by a team of researchers who were trying to understand the movement of populations across Central Asia. They found that approximately 1 in every 200 men alive on Earth today carries a specific Y chromosome pattern that traces back to a single ancestor in northeastern Mongolia approximately 800 years ago. 1 in 200. Across a planet of 8 billion people, that is a number too large to hold as a number and has to be held as a fact instead. He is in the world still, in the most literal biological sense available to science, moving through the generations in the same direction as time, the way the living always travel, forward and forward and forward without looking back. The Silk Road corridors he secured are the basis of modern Central Asian trade routes. The legal principle he enforced, that messengers and diplomats travel in safety, is the foundation of the diplomatic immunity that every embassy in every nation on earth operates under today. The religious tolerance he encoded into law was radical in his century and is still, honestly, radical in ours. He left things in the world that the world is still using. You have traveled a long way tonight, from a river in northeastern Mongolia where a 9-year-old stood in the cold, all the way to the mountain that holds him still, across 800 years of the most compressed human story the steppe ever produced. Sleep well, the way Holun slept on the hardest nights, with intention, with her children breathing nearby, having done everything available to her and releasing the rest to the morning. Sleep well, the way the men at Baljuna slept, after drinking the muddy water together and making their oath, with the specific peace of people who have committed to something real. Sleep well, the way a man sleeps on a sacred mountain after a prayer that cost him everything he had to give, having placed the weight of his life in hands larger than his own and trusted those hands to hold it through the dark. Good night, and may whatever you are trying to hold, whatever your own closed fist has been gripping through the difficulty of your particular life, feel a little less impossible to hold in the morning. Somewhere in northeastern Mongolia, the mountain called Burkhan Khaldun stands in the late night exactly as it has always stood, with the stars above it that have always been above it, keeping something safe in its body that the world has been looking for 800 years and has not found and will not find, because some things are not meant to be found, only remembered.